Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shahid.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Can you hear me, Huda?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good. Let's just wait. Sorry?
Laiba asked me to give you a message.
Yeah.
She's attending today.
Yeah, yes. Okay. No, that's in order. I'm recording this thing, but I'll do it again on the YouTube, and I hope, because I'm supposed to be able to give you the recording immediately, but I don't know how that works. But were you able to listen to the recording on the YouTube one last week?
Yes, I did, Dr. Shahid.
Okay, I hope we won't be so long this time, because also then, anyway, let's see how it goes. We're just waiting for, I think, Nazneen and Alima Nazneen and Sheikh Noor. Yes, then the other people won't make it. Okay, let's just give it a few minutes. Inshallah. Okay. Let's see. It's already 1 minute past. Look, I think we should go ahead. Maybe another minute. Let me ask which Darul Ulum or Institute are you at, Alima Huda?
I was at RPL Exam, Dr. Shahid.
So which one? Sorry, I didn't hear.
Madrasa Mu'inul Islam.
Oh, mashallah. Where's that one? Where's it situated?
You know where the boys, Dr. Shahid?
Oh, in Zakaria Park. That's towards. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I've been there many years ago, so I know more or less the area. Is it close to there? Okay.
Close to the boys' madrasa.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's good. In which years were you there, if I may ask?
I completed 1997.
Right. Mashallah. Okay. At the time I went to 1997, I was just finishing in Egypt, Al Azhar, but I had one more year. That was when I went. I had a friend. I had lots of friends with Zakaria. We were together as youngsters, and then they went there. Yeah. It's a very good. It's one of the longest standing madrasas. But is your madrasa the same as Zakaria? Just it's the one for women. Is that it? Is it the same madrasa?
It's all under the same umbrella.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's not the same. We completely separate. Are separate.
Oh, okay. Okay. But you did like the Dars Nizami and all those the lesson. I'm also asking because I think it's it's really good if one day people think about writing. For example, you can do an honest research essay on that, you know. I don't know where she is, my boy. She's outside because she's by the car. Go see, she's at the car, my boy. Okay. Anyway, I think we should start, Alima, because I'm not sure. Alima Nazneen did say that she'll be joining us.
Okay.
As you saw on the WhatsApp group. So let's continue. Look, I'll start again, you know, depending on when they join where. Look, so what is important, just to quickly recap, right? So what is important is that we want to know, or rather, we're focusing on Fazlur Rahman's definition of Sunnah, the lexical meaning, but more important when it comes to the notion of the behavioral concept. That's one. Number two, he gives the views of the Orientalists. You know, there are like 2 or 3 names he cites: Laments, Goldzar, and Shacht. And their understanding of what the Sunnah was. In essence, they rejected that there's something called the Sunnah of the Prophet. Of course, you'll see that they don't all say exactly the same thing, but they come to the understanding that there's no such thing called the Sunnah of Muhammad, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, right? Number 3, based on this, Fazlur Rahman, as opposed to the Orientals, he says, no, there was definitely something called Sunnah of the Prophet, right? And the Sunnah of the Prophet is his exemplary conduct, his behavior, that the Prophet set an ideal which his companions sought to emulate, and Muslims thereafter. From that, number 4, Fazlur Rahman, though, before I come to point number 4, agrees with the Orientalists that the mass body of what we know today is the Sunnah in the form of the Hadith, that is not all ascribed, does not all come from the Prophet. Hence, number 4, Fazlur Rahman differentiate, or he places two, to explain Sunnah. He says we have to place one thing vis-a-vis something else. He speaks about, he says here we must understand Sunnah as, oh, Nazneen has just joined us, right? That's Alima Nazneen has just joined. Let's just wait. She's just saying, I'm sure she's in the home. Let me see. Okay. Okay, Alima Nazneen, you can hear us? Are you with us?
Yeah, I can hear. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. It appears that I'm the only other person I'm waiting for is Sheikh Muhammad Noor, but there's no sign. Okay, so let's continue. I was just doing a quick summary of last week, right? So, and this is really important for the exam purposes. So Fazlur Rahman says that Sunnah, we must understand Sunnah as concept on the one hand, vis-a-vis Sunnah as content, right? So the concept is from the Prophet. That is the Prophet's exemplary conduct. The Prophet is an ideal. The Prophet as the teacher of the community. The Prophet as the founder. That is the concept. Right. On the other hand, we have what is called Sunnah of the content. Now here, Fazlur Rahman's view is, it's not only what the Prophet said and did like we know today, the hadith, but also what the especially the first two, the early generations. So I'll come back later. Please remind me of what we mean with generation, something you're familiar with, but just to make it more explicit, so to speak. So the content of the Sunnah, and I'm going to get into that. Let me take you, open up your reading, please. If you go to the bottom of page 14, we may go back a few pages later, but just go to page 14 of that reading. Right? You'll see there the paragraph that's got the Roman numerals number 7 of a V and 2, right? Are you both there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay. Okay. But Alima Huda and you also there. Okay. Right. So let's see there. On there, let me read that sentence. It says, the necessary instrument whereby the prophetic model. Now this prophetic model, that word in itself, that means Sunnah is the concept, right? was progressively developed into a definite and specific code of human behavior by the early generations of Muslims, was responsible free thought activity. That word free thought activity, I know it's in yellow, but even if you can just focus again. This rational thinking called ra'i, right? You have this rational thinking called ra'i, which is the Arabic word for opinion. But Fazlur Rahman translate not just as opinion, but as personal free thought activity or personal considered opinion, produced an immense, now this is very important here, produced an immense wealth, produced, just 1 second please, just 1 second please.
Because your guys are.
Zoom class. I switched off my video. Mic is on because he's asked. Oh wait, I think I have it. Wait.
Sorry about that. I just had this. I was just talking to my son, right? So let's go there. And now that view there at the bottom on page 14. Are you there? Okay. At the bottom of page 14 there. So that sentence there that says, produce an immense wealth of legal, what we'd call fiqh, you know, like you have the madhabs and fiqh, religious you refer to what later is when you study ilm al-kalam, right? Like for example, you heard about the Asha'ira, the Maturidiyya, the Khawarij, and all that, and moral ideas. Moral is what we study is akhlaq or targhib and tarhibs, all that. He says, now that definition during the, and I go on to page 15, first century and a half approximately. Now, all that last sentence still there, that is sunnah, that is known as the content. If I'm not clear, please, say to me again. So what Fadlur Rahman says, so the Sahaba had the Prophet as a model. The Prophet didn't speak everything, as said last week, being a pan-legist, but they produced thinking. They said something about, and I'll give you an example. Let me give you an example. You know, when under the Prophet Muhammad, when the Muslims fought the jihad, right? For example, you know the battles, right? Please, you can come in anytime if you want to say something. Just let me let me know. So you know, for example, there was the battle of Badr, there was the battle of Uhud, there was the battle of Khandaq. Now, in these battles, when the Muslims won, they used to take what is called the ghanima. You know ghanima, right? Ghanima is spoils of war. Okay. So what is spoils of war? Now there's an ayah in the Quran, the beginning of Surah Al, or the beginning of the 10th juz. It says, وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّمَا غَنِمْتُمْ فَأَنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِرَسُولِهِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى and the ayah goes on. It says, know that what you have taken, ghanimtum, ghanima, أَنَّمَا غَنِمْتُمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ, you know, in your battles against the enemies. So the Prophet used to do what? Four-fifths of the spoils of war taken, he used to divide among the fighters. Are you with me? And 1/5 the Prophet kept. This 1/5, like let's call it went to the state. Here it belonged to Allah, and of course Allah doesn't need this. And the Prophet would then give to his next of kin, he'd give to the wayfarer, to the orphans, etc. That 1/5, in other words, it went to the state, if you want. Now this is how the Prophet divided up the spoils of war, the ghanima, in all the battles up until he passed away. Now, when the Muslims in the time of the Khulafa, example, in the time of Umar bin al-Khattab, the Muslims conquered, as you know, Persia, right? The Muslims army conquered Persia and Iraq. Now they conquered Persia. So some of the fighters and some of the Sahaba went to Umar and said, listen, you must divide the spoils of war like the Prophet did. You must give 4/5 to the fighters and 1/5 to the state. Umar refused. He said, no, I will not do that. Now, what's happening here? He said, no, I won't do that. And Umar called all the Sahaba together, and Umar cited an ayah in the Quran that has seemingly nothing to do with the question of spoils of war. He quoted an ayah in Surah Al-Hashr, which is Surah number 59. The surah starts, at least that part of the surah, it doesn't start like that. It speaks about the Muhajirin, okay, the people of the Muslims of Makkah who migrated. Then it speaks about the Ansar. Then it speaks an ayah where Umar says, I don't want Muslims thereafter to be angry. Rabbana, what the verse says, ربنا اغفر لنا والإخوان الذين سبقونا بالإيمان. This ayah refers to posterity, to people who will come thereafter like us. It says that forgive us, ربنا اغفر لنا والإخوان الذين سبقونا بالإيمان, and those who came before us in iman, ولا تجعل في قلوبنا, and don't make in our hearts غل, rancor and hate. So Umar was saying, no, you can't divide the land. But his biggest thing was, you can't divide land. What are you going to do with the populations of these countries? What are you going to do to the people who are living there? You're going to have to remove people from their land. Because the Iraqis, in the Prophet's time, we fought against a tribe. They came with their goats and their camels. This was movable properties. You can take somebody's sheep. You can take their goat and maybe their jewelry. But now you're going to displace the masses. So Umar said, no, I am not going to divide the land that way. And most of the Sahaba supported him. Some were insistent on the 4/5. Umar said that no, it doesn't mean because the Prophet did it that way. Because in the Prophet's time, the situation was different. Are you with me? And therefore, what Umar then did, the spoils of war were no longer divided. Umar established what's called the Diwan, a big register, and soldiers now used to get salaries from the state. Are you with me? If you go to the Kitab al-Kharaj, you'll see that Umar gave certain, already starting from the time of Abu Bakr, he started putting out portions, money, for example. So everybody used to get in allocations. The wives of the Prophet got so much. Those who fought at Badr got so much. Those who fought at Uhud got so much. The point is, even though they now fought and took spoils of war, all that money was not divided among the soldiers, the 4/5. Do you understand? So what I'm saying is that example, people say Fadlur Rahman. So for Fadlur Rahman, Umar's decision is sunnah. Are you with me? Not only Umar, everybody else, including the Sahaba and this generation after the Sahaba, if they came up with a view, that would be sunnah, and that is content. Let me pause a little bit here, and you can both tell me what do you, is that clear what I said, or if anything is not clear? Let me hear from you two now, but.
Dr. Shahid, what I want to know is, did Umar question the 4/5 of the booty?
Yes.
Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam distributed the 4/5
Yes.
fighters, and then the 1/5 to the state. Umar then came in the picture after demise and said, no, we will that way anymore. But did he change the 1/5
No,
aspect of it?
all of the, for example, I mean, we'll have to read a bit more, right, to go into the depth of the discussion. No, but everything was now part of the Baytul Mal, what is called the public treasury. And from the public treasury, so in other words, the orphans still used to get their stipend. Are you with me? The wayfarers still used to get the stipend. The al-yatam al-masakin, those in need, al-fuqara. But what our focus is that, so everything now went to the Baytul Mal, okay? What is called the public treasury, or the exchequer, or the treasury in modern language. And from there, so the point is here, Nazneen, is that everybody still got their stipend. But our focus with this is to show that the 4/5. So in a way, to answer your question, yes, the 1/5 still went to where it was supposed to go to. But the 4/5 now are no longer distributed as it was in the time of the Prophet. Do you understand the point? About,
No, I understand.
Alima Huda, do you understand that?
Yeah, I understand, Dr. Shay.
Look, the point is, but bigger than the example. These are just examples. Let's call them examples, people. But we want to come to an overarching framework and understanding. Understanding is what Fadlur Rahman is trying to say to you. You see that now what Umar's action is sunnah. The point is today so Omar is Fazlur Rahman is speaking to two groups of people. The Orientalists in one side, Fazlur Rahman is saying, but Omar was inspired by the Prophet. What was the Prophet's aim with distributing the spoils of war? Was to come to justice, and that's what the Prophet did. So Omar also wanted to come to justice in the way he now, with the new regime, with the new way of arranging the spoils of war. Do you understand what Fazlur Rahman is saying? So Fazlur Rahman is saying the Prophet's concept is Sunnah is a behavioral and ideal pattern. Omar followed that ideal pattern. This is Fazlur Rahman's view. And by following that ideal pattern, he's saying that no, we can't displace the local. What are you going to do with all these Egyptians, all these Iraqis, and all these Iranian people? Are you going to throw them off their land? That is what colonialism, for example, did. That is what colonial rule did when it went to Africa, it went to Asia, to India, etc. In fact, what the Muslims then did for a long time is that they would keep the local population, and therefore another text developed. It's called Kharaj. It said to the local populations, keep your farms, keep everything, but you will pay a tenth out of this, al-ushr, and a certain kharaj, another tax to the state. Because why? The Muslims often were not farmers. The people who came from Makkah and Al-Madinah, for example, were not, of course, at that immediate stage. So later they become farmers. So say to these Christians and these Jews and these Zoroastrians, keep your farms, stay on your farms, produce your agriculture, because we need food, but you will now pay, for example, a certain tax. Are you all with me? And that is the point that Fazlur Rahman is trying to raise. So he's saying that Omar's action is Sunnah. That constitutes Sunnah. But Sunnah as what? As content. So the concept is always the on top. And the content, as Fazlur Rahman is saying, that is inspired by the notion of concept. Let me give you another example away from the state. Abdullah bin Mas'ud was once asked, now this is after the Prophet had passed away, right? Abdullah bin Mas'ud was asked, a couple got married, but the husband and the wife had not made an agreement on mahar. All right, you know mahar, right? So mahar is, you know, is not a rukn, is not fundamental to making a marriage contract valid. Rather, mahar is a consequence. In other words, you can have a marriage where no mahar is mentioned. Of course, it's not what happens practically, but you can have, in other words, assuming that a couple gets married and they didn't decide on mahar, right? The marriage will be valid. Okay. In all the madhahib, all the madhahib, right? So this couple got married. And as you know, according to the Quran, that of course, if they've agreed on the mahar, then the husband must give the full mahar. Okay? But if it is not been, marriage not been consummated, he must give half the mahar. Right? Half the mahar. Of course, if they've agreed on the mahar, which we call in the fiqh al-mahar al-musamma, right? And marriage is consummated, then he must give the full mahar. If it is not consummated, he must give half the mahar. But now what happens? Right? And of course, if the husband die, any one of them die, they will inherit from one another. But now Abdullah bin Mas'ud, the Sahabi, the companion of the Prophet, was asked this question, that this couple got married, they did not agree on any mahar, there was no consummation, and the husband died. What now? What now? And the husband died. So Abdullah bin Mas'ud didn't know, but he ventured an answer to say that this woman must get what is called al-mahr al-mithl, what we call in fiqh al-mahr al-mithl, which is a suitable mahr. What is a suitable mahr? I translate it as suitable, but it's not a very accurate, it's not a very clear word. It means she has to look at the mahr, for example, her sister got, right? A sister, which will be a full sister, or a sister from her father's side, or her father's sisters. Whatever her father's sisters got or her sister got, assuming she has a sister who's already married, you say, and then from his estate, that she will get that mahar. But Abdullah bin Mas'ud did not have any hadith. He just said that. Now, today we find that in the fiqh. But in this case, there was another person apparently standing next to Abdullah bin Mas'ud. He said, I heard the Prophet giving the same ruling. So there was a hadith, according now, a sunnah. So there was a sunnah of the Prophet. Abdullah bin Mas'ud was rather happy. He said, glory be to God who made my saying to coincide with that of the Prophet. But the point was, Abdullah bin Mas'ud was prepared to pronounce on something which there was no immediate, if you want, there was no immediate instruction from the Quran and from the Sunnah. Now, all these examples, and if you read the pages prior to page 14, right, where Malik says something and this one says something, you'll find lots of examples where the Sahabas and the Sahaba and the Tabi'een gave their opinions, right? And that became Sunnah. For Fazlur Rahman, let's go back to page 14. You see, he stands in awe of that. He says that shows the greatness of the, he says, you see the word, the necessary instrument, right? He says, because they all looked at the Prophet, they all inspired, they gave their own opinions. Sometimes their opinions, even as we'll see in examples when we do the class, in more detail, even contradictory to the Prophet, right? He says, the rational thinking called ray or personal concept opinion produce an immense wealth of legal, religious, and moral ideas. This people, in sum, that is the content of the Sunnah. Are you with me? So let me take you just go up page 14 there. All right. No, let's go to page 13. I want to give you another example there's so many examples. So there's often a debate, can women, for example, be witnesses in marriage and in divorce? Are you both with me? All right. Can women, for example, be witnesses in marriage and divorce? Can a woman be a wali for another woman? And here we find the established positions that no, women can't be witnesses in marriage and divorce. Okay, women can't be wali. Is that from the Prophet or is it a later development? This is the type of question. So today we have it as sunnah. So for example, somebody who says, you'll see there on top of on page 13, I've translated there in qad madat as-sunnatu. Qad madat. Can you see there on page 13? It's highlighted in yellow. Translated as established sunnah has been. Now Ibn Zinad, for example, Ibn Zinad said, قد مضت السنة ألا تقبل شهادة المرأة في الزواج والطلاق. The sunnah, the established sunnah is that a woman's witness is not accepted in marriage and divorce. The big question here, is this the sunnah of the Prophet as content? Or, is that what the Prophet said? Or is it what the Sahaba said? And these are the type of questions we'd be looking at. So for example, Ummul Mu'mineen Aisha married off her brother's daughter without him being present. So she was a wali. She acted as waliya. Ummul Mu'mineen Aisha married off Abdurrahman, her brother's daughter, and he wasn't even present. So now, wait a minute. But if you remember, there's a hadith that says, Ayyuma imra'atin nakahat nafsaha. There is a hadith that, today there is a hadith that a woman cannot marry off herself, nor can she marry off somebody else. And then there's a saying that some of his scholars said it's ascribed to Abu Huraira, who says, "Kul ayyu imra'atin ankahat nafsaha fahiya zaniya." The woman who marries off herself, that is the adulteress. The big question is that hadith, is it from the Prophet or from the Sahabi? Look, I don't want you to focus your attention on the examples, but I'm giving examples so that you can understand the broad framework. So that some people would say that is the content. Abu Huraira would have understood the Prophet to say that. Let me give you another example. I'm giving examples so that we're not just abstract. On the breastfeeding of Al-Kabir, of a major boy. Now, let us be very careful with in fiqh. What is meant with Kabir? Now, you know the word Kabir means big, right? Now, the big example it is a hadith in Sahih Muslim and in the Muwatta, where the Prophet said to Sahla binti Suhail, she came to the Prophet, she said, we had adopted Salim. You know the story of Salim, right? He was called Salim Mawla Abi Hudhaifa. She and her husband. In fact, she said Salim became big and we have a very small house and it's very difficult because I only have one piece of dress. And she says, I think it's something difficult for Abu Hudhaifa. Remember, this is all before even the laws that says you can't adopt, you know, where you can't adopt in a very strict legal sense, right? So Salim used to live with them in the house. So she came to the Prophet and said, it's this difficulty because he's not our son, he's our adopted son. And I think it's creating, it's making some difficulties for Abi Hudhaifa. So the Prophet said to Sahla binti Suhail, you must breastfeed him. This is the hadith in Sahih Muslim. But Salim was a big boy already. Some would think, he was like mukallaf. But just to draw your attention to something, and when in fiqh, when in under Kitabur Rada'a, the book of breastfeeding, when we speak about big, we don't necessarily mean big as in mukallaf. We mean anyone older than 2 years old. Please understand this difference. It's very, very important. We must be very technical. So a 3-year-old boy is big. He's Zusan Kabir. A 21-year-old man is big. They all fall. In others after 2 years. But nevertheless, the bigger point is that, so Sahla, then, according to this hadith, and well, the hadith doesn't say, the Prophet just told her, breastfeed him. And apparently apparently she did that. Now this is interesting because Mu'mineen Aisha understood, and therefore after the Prophet said, when men wanted to come to learn from her, you know, because she was a muftiya, right? You know that Mu'mineen Aisha was a muftiya. So she, before men could come and learn or talk to about dini matters, she used to send them to her sister, right? And her sister's daughters, Kulthum, and what's the others, and Asma's daughters, so that there are many hadith that says, first go to my sisters, and in fact, Aisha held the view that they must breastfeed you 10 times. And how did Aisha come to this ruling? She said, well, if the Prophet said that to Sahla, then it means it's sunnah. But the rest of the Prophet's wives disagreed. They said, no, that was a special ruling for Salim. Are you with me, people? Do you understand? So what I'm saying is that it is because people differently understood what the Prophet would have done. That's the point I want. To do this example, I don't want to focus on the example, please. The example is just to illustrate. The point was that that Aisha understood that this ruling is a general ruling. So, for example, somebody could come today and says, well, if the Prophet did it, that's sunnah. In fact, this is in 2006, what was in Egypt. One of the sheikhs in Egypt said that women shouldn't be working, you know, women in the workspace, because she's sitting among men, strange men, you know, they are not maharim, they are not maharim, they are not mahram to her. So he suggested that this woman, and the wording of that 2006 fatwa was that this woman should breastfeed these men. Later on, another fatwa came from Saudi. No, does that have to be physical? She can express milk, and then they can drink this milk. Whichever way, the mahramiyah, you know, the prohibitive relationship be established. So what you see, my point is with this. Can you see how Mu'minin Aisha understood the hadith? She said that no, it's a general ruling. It's not only to Salim. Whereas the other wives of the Prophet said that no, it's only a general ruling. It's a specific ruling. Do you understand, people? Now, Fazlur Rahman, let's go back to Fazlur Rahman. For Fazlur Rahman, this thinking, the opinions, what he calls there, what does he call it? The considered person, right at the bottom there of page 14, is called what personal considered opinion, not just any, you know, just an opinion because I feel like, no, it's inspired by a model, which is the concept. I think the point is clear. Can I take, you understand that from me?
Gee, I'm beginning to understand everything, Gee.
Right. I've began putting it on a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll soon send to you, inshallah. I was just a bit busy with that. And that is the thing. So for Umar, so lots of these ahadi that whether they're in Bukhari or in Muslim, they ascribe to the Prophet. Fazlur Rahman saying that no, the Prophet didn't say all that. People, to put it superficially, he says, in fact, the majority of those things don't come from the Prophet. It was later that Muslims now started ascribing their views to the Prophet. This is a particular Orientalist view, which we'll discuss one day. But for Fazlur Rahman, the Prophet did not he simply didn't have the time, according to Fazlur Rahman. He was fighting wars. He was seeing to his household. The Prophet couldn't. In for example, the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, you have more ahadith than the Sihah Sitta put together. You think the Prophet pronounced each and everything? He says no. The Prophet didn't. So many of these ahadith that we have today, according to Fadlur Rahman, which is now synonymous with Sunnah, and is now say the Prophet said this, the Prophet didn't say that, the Sahaba said that, the Tabi'in said that, but it came somehow later in time, it came to be ascribed to the Prophet. Nevertheless, the point is for Fazlur Rahman that shows, and that's why he stands in awe of it. He says it shows that they were thinkers, that they engaged the society. Right? Or else for the Orientalists, no, but for them is that these things, they also say that this was prior to Islam, but what is missing, what is different between Fazlur Rahman and Orientalists, the Orientalists don't see the Prophet as a model behavior, as an exemplar. Do you understand? And for Fazlur Rahman, the Prophet is an exemplar. It is precisely the Prophet inspired the Sahaba to produce this immense, what he calls there, produce an immense wealth of legal, religious, and moral ideas known as the content of the Sunnah, which became the Hadith. Is that clear, people? Okay. I want to now, for Fazlur Rahman, and I want you quickly to write down, if you've got a pen and a paper, just write down, I'll explain it. Just write this down, the word ijtihad, hyphen, ijtihad, hyphen, ijma, you know what we know, the concept of ijma, right, or consensus, hyphen, sunnah. Are you with me? Did you write that down?
Gee.
Okay.
Yes, Doctor.
Right. Now this is a, let's call it a specific type of formula. Now, today, do you know the four sources, the four hierarchy of how we derive laws today for Muslims, that you've learned? Obviously, for Muslims today, not even used obviously, the way it's understood is that we have the Quran, right? When you want an answer for something, you first go where? To the Quran. Am I correct? Am I correct? Are you not sure?
Yes. No.
Right. Then after Quran comes what? Sunnah, right? Right, that's the hierarchy. And next to Sunnah, just put in brackets, you can put the Hadith, because by now we understand Sunnah and Hadith as synonymous. Am I right? We understand both as synonymous. Right, Hadith. Then after Hadith, you have what is called Ijma', isn't it? Right, consensus. And then after Ijma', you have what is called Qiyas. Am I correct? These four, you've learned about this in the madrasa, right? So you go to the Quran, the Sunnah, and Hadith here. So you go to Al-Bukhari. So for example, how do we know so for example, how do we know that drinking alcohol is haram? How do we know drinking alcohol is haram? The Quran says, doesn't the Quran says, إنما الخمر والميسر والأنساب والأزلام رجس من عمل الشيطان فاجتنبوه لعلكم تفلحون. Right? Now, for example, so sometimes the Sunnah and you studies come to clarify things, but now, or let's say the Quran says who we can't marry, right? In Surah An-Nisa. So one can't marry your father, your brother, you can't marry your mother, your sister, you know, if you go to the ayah number 23, right? But we have in fiqh that a man can't marry his wife and her aunt at the same time. A man can't marry his wife and her aunt or her niece at the same time. That's not in the Quran. That's in the Hadith. فَإِنَّكُمْ إِنْ فَعَلْتُمُ ذَلِكَ قَطَعْتُمْ أَرْحَامَكُمْ. Because if you do that, you'll be cutting your right. So now a man can marry. He can't. So if he's married to a woman, he can't marry her father's sister or her mother's sister. Likewise, he can't marry her brother's daughter or her sister's daughter. That is in the Sunnah. Okay. If there's nothing in the Quran and the Sunnah, I mean, explicitly, you go to the ijma, the consensus of the ummah. All right? Ijma is that, so you'd have, so there's no direct instruction in the Quran vis-a-vis a certain matter, so you go to the ijma. If there's nothing in ijma, you then go to qiyas. Qiyas is analogical deduction. So, for example, the famous example they always give, the Quran says that alcohol is haram or khamr, right? But the Quran doesn't say anything about drugs. So how do we know that drugs are haram? Are drugs haram?
Okay.
But why? So
Because
Alima Huda, if somebody says to you, but why are drugs haram? Kid, on basis of your religion, how are you going to say it's haram?
Dr. Shay, because it intoxicates the mind.
Precisely.
So that's why.
Exactly. But there's no ruling on drugs. But you take the ruling from khamr, which is intoxication. Kullu khamrin muskir, right? It intoxicates. So if drugs the same as khamr, right? And so, and there are hundreds of examples, right? And therefore, it's haram. So that's the hierarchy that we have today. Now I gave you, now Fazlura, so this is understood as a type of hierarchy. First Quran, then Sunnah, then Ijma'. That is what is the classical that we have up till today. The one I gave you before, Fazlur Rahman starts with Ijtihad. He said, no. There wasn't such a hierarchy prior to the first three generations. People, before I go further with this two formulas that I outline now, I want to speak about the generations. Remember when we speak about the early generations, we speak about the first generation. And generation could be decided by various factors. But now we're speaking about the early Muslim generation. The first generation, you know the very famous hadith that says, Khairul Qurun Qarni, right? They read it in every Jumu'ah also. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. In other riwayat comes Khairul Nas, Qarni, Khairul Qurun Qarni, Khairul Nas, etc. So the first generation would be the Prophet and his Sahaba. That will be the first generation. Right? Are you with me? Just that's the first generation. The second generation will be the generation after the Prophet passed away, which would include the Sahaba, of course, because many of the Sahaba lived long after the Prophet had passed on, right? They are called the Sahaba, the second generation. It's called the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. Tabi'een means the generation immediately who saw the companions. And then the third generation is that the generation that follows after the last Sahabi passed away, right? And they are just the Tabi'een. So you can see, so the first generation would only be about 23 years with Islam. Those who saw the Prophet, who believed in Islam and who died as Muslims. When the Prophet died in the year 11 Hijri, now we have the second generation, which consists of many of the Sahaba still, but also the Tabi'een, like Sa'id ibn Musayyab, like Zayn al-Abidin, like Masruq, like many of the very important early figures, like Ikrimah, like Hassan al-Basri, etc. When the last Sahabi dies around whether 93 Hijri, like Anas bin Malik, or 100 Hijri, then we have the third generation, right? Which is now only the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een. So the Tabi'een are those who saw the companions, like Abu Hanifa is regarded as a Tabi'een, right? But who outlived the last Sahabi. Now, if a person who never saw a Sahabi, right, that will be a Tabi'een, like Abu Hanifa's two students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani. Nevertheless, that first, up till from the year that Islam, the Hijri calendar starts, with the Prophet's al-Hijrah from Makkah to al-Madinah, right? Up until the year 150 Hijri, about 150 years. Now it's not exactly, people, but we have to work with something more or less. There's nothing that's surgically precise, but just to have a broad understanding. So when we speak about the early generations, because you'll hear me using this word, the early generations, it means the first 150 years. Okay? Is that clear? Right. Anyway, so Fazlur, now why am I coming to this point very quickly? Fazlur Rahman's point is that in this first 150 years, this second hierarchy of Quran, in that formula, Quran, Sunnah, meaning hadith, sunnah and hadith being the same, ijma' and qiyas, this did not exist. This is a later development. This developed, in fact, not even after the first 150 years, right? But it becomes very much refined 400 years later. But put that out of your minds now, because I don't want to come back. Fazlur Rahman says, nevertheless, in this first 150 years, in other words, this first 3 generations, what was the understanding? You first had ijtihad. Now note in the other one, sorry, I was saying to you qiyas. For Al-Imam Shafi'i, we're going to really focus on him a little bit. Ijtihad and qiyas is the same thing, are the same things. Ijtihad and qiyas are the same thing. Fazlur Rahman says, no, for the first 3 generations of Muslims, it wasn't like that. It starts with ijtihad. Are you with me? Right? And from ijtihad, it goes to ijma'. And from ijma', it becomes sunnah. There's an organic, but it's not a vertical for him, it's an horizontal. It's a organic relationship. You know, organic, there are certain organs within society, right? Like organ structures within society. Are you with me, people? Because this is really going to be the last, there's going to be 2 more points that we're going to discuss on this book in preparation for the exam. So Fazlur Rahman says, what we have was ijtihad, this individual thinking, this considered personal opinion that's based on something. So somebody has an opinion. For example, I gave you the example of Omar and the booty and the spoils of war. Okay, and the spoils of war. Right. So that's Omar's decision. Omar has a personal considered opinion. He's inspired, remember, don't forget, he's inspired by the concept of the Prophet Sunnah. He has this opinion that no, we will not divide the booty or the spoils of war 4/5. We will all put it into the public treasury. That's his ijtihad. So it starts from the Rahman, it starts with an individual ijtihad. Now, some Sahabi did not agree, some others. So now Umar gets all the Muslims together, the Sahaba, his council, and then he convinces them, they agree with him, then it becomes a consensus. Are you with me? Ijma'. They all said, okay, yeah, Umar, I had this opinion, but your opinion makes sense. You are speaking more justice. You are saying we can't displace people. You are more strategic. Then it becomes an ijma'. After it's in ijma', now it becomes a sunnah. Are you with me? So you see, sunnah only here, the discussion will stop now, then we won't be long thereafter, then you just log on again, people, on the same link, right? As soon as it ends, you go there. So what Omar is saying, so it started with Omar's individual view. Note, there's no explicit Quran